All right, so today we are going deep, deep, deep into the book of 2 Corinthians.
Ooh, exciting.
And I know what you might be thinking. Okay, another Bible study. But hold on, because this is not your typical Sunday school lesson. We're going to uncover the really surprisingly human side of Paul.
Right.
This giant figure, this towering figure of early Christianity.
Yeah.
And we're going to see how his struggles and his triumphs still hit home even today. We're going to be working directly with passages from 2 Corinthians.
Well, that's what's so fascinating about this letter, right? Is that Paul, who we often think of as this almost like superhuman figure of faith, he really lets his guard down in 2 Corinthians.
Totally.
We see raw emotion, doubts, frustration.
Yeah.
It's shockingly relatable,
Yeah.
even if you're, not a religious person.
Totally.
Yeah.
I was really struck by the emotional intensity right from the jump, like the opening lines.
Yes.
He expresses gratitude for God's comfort, but then he talks about this like really deep suffering that he experienced. It's almost like a death sentence was hanging over him. I mean, that sets a pretty intense tone for the rest of the letter, don't you think?
It absolutely does. And it makes you wonder, what exactly was he going through? Because he mentions facing severe affliction
Right.
in the Roman province of Asia, but he doesn't give us specifics.
Right.
And that lack of detail, I think it almost makes it more powerful.
I agree.
Because it allows each of us to connect with that feeling
Right.
of being overwhelmed by something that we can't even really put into words.
Yeah, it's like he's inviting us into his pain, but without, like, burdening us with the specifics of it.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of things left unsaid, there's this whole thing with Paul canceling a planned visit to the Corinthians.
Yeah.
And it seems like he knew they wouldn't be happy about it.
Oh, absolutely. And back then, saying, like, yes, yes, and no, no at the same time was a huge breach of trust.
Right, right.
And so Paul goes to great lengths to defend his integrity. I mean, he's practically shouting, I swear I'm not messing with you. He even calls on God and Jesus as witnesses to his trustworthiness.
You really get the sense that his reputation is on the line, right? But for him, it wasn't just about saving face, I think. He wanted them to understand that his commitment to them was rooted in something much deeper. His commitment to God. And it makes you think about those, like, living letters that we're all writing with our actions. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Are we flaky?
Yeah.
Are we unreliable?
Right.
Or are we living in a way that really shows what we say we believe?
It's a powerful connection.
Yeah.
Because Paul actually uses that exact metaphor, living letter, later on.
Does he really?
He does. He describes the Corinthians themselves as a letter of recommendation for him.
Okay.
Written not with ink, but with the Spirit of God.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it?
So he's saying that their changed lives, the good that they've done because of him, that is the most powerful proof of the work he's been doing there.
That's exactly it. But I do think some listeners might be like, okay, but what does Spirit of God actually mean? Like, can you unpack that a little bit? It's kind of a loaded term.
Right.
In a nutshell, the Spirit of God refers to, for Christians, the divine presence.
Okay.
The divine power that they believe dwells within them. It's like the force, that empowers them to live a life that reflects God's character. So when Paul says the Corinthians are a letter written by the Spirit, he's essentially saying that their lives are a reflection of God's work in them.
And that ties back to this whole integrity thing, right?
Right.
It's not just about talking the talk. It's about walking the walk.
Yeah, yeah.
If we were to write a letter about our own lives, what would it say? Would it be a letter of recommendation? A letter of apology?
Or something in between.
Or like, to whom it may concern, please disregard the previous letter.
Right, right.
But let's stick with Paul for a bit longer. He goes on to compare two different ministries, right? Yeah. You've got the ministry of Moses, which is all about the law, written on those stone tablets.
Yep.
And then you have the ministry of the Spirit, which obviously Paul's a big fan of.
He is.
And to illustrate this point, he talks about Moses wearing a veil to shield the Israelites from the fading glory of his face.
Oh, yeah.
After meeting with God on Mount Sinai. I mean, can you imagine that scene? Moses coming down the mountain, his face like radiating with his otherworldly light, and people are like awestruck and terrified at the same time.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
And Paul uses it to make this bigger point, right? He's saying that even that incredible sight, Moses' veiled face,
right,
pales in comparison to the glory of the Spirit's ministry.
Okay, so what exactly is the Spirit's ministry, and why is it so much more glorious than a faith that literally glows in the dark?
Good question. For Paul, the Spirit's ministry wasn't about external rules and regulations. It was about a radical internal transformation.
Okay, so it's like an inside job.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so less about what we do and more about who we are.
Precisely.
But Paul's also quick to acknowledge that this powerful ministry that he's talking about, this life-changing spirit stuff, it's housed in, well, a pretty fragile container. Himself.
Yeah, right.
He uses this striking image, treasure in clay jars, to describe that tension between the power of the message and the weakness of the messenger.
Right.
And if we need a reminder of just how fragile those clay jars can be, Paul goes on to list the hardships he's endured: persecution, imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks.
Wow.
Even a stoning. I mean, that's a pretty rough resume.
It is.
It's like he's saying, look, I'm just a regular dude, prone to weakness, suffering, but somehow God's power is working through me anyway.
It's almost paradoxical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Strength and weakness.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from his human limitations.
Yeah.
He embraces them.
So we've got Paul, this fragile but dedicated dude, carrying the treasure of the Spirit's ministry. Where do we go from here?
Well, next Paul takes us on kind of a mystical journey. He shares this incredibly intriguing story about a man, and he heavily implies it's himself being caught up to the third heaven and paradise.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. He says he heard unspeakable things.
I know.
Things too sacred to share.
It's frustrating, right?
He's like a master storyteller, leaving us hanging on a cliffhanger.
He is.
What do you think he experienced? Come on, give us your theories.
It's one of the most fascinating and debated passages in the entire letter. Some scholars think he had a vision. Others think he might have been referring to some kind of mystical experience. Whatever it was, it clearly left a huge mark on him.
It makes you wonder if some truths are just like beyond human language.
Yeah.
Something we can only grasp through experience, not through words.
I think so.
But even without knowing the specifics, we can appreciate the impact it had on Paul.
Right. For sure.
It's like he's saying, you wouldn't believe me even if I told you.
And speaking of things we might not fully understand, after that tantalizing glimpse of heaven, we come back down to earth with a thud when Paul starts talking about a thorn in the flesh. This persistent affliction that he begged God to remove.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this mysterious thorn?
Well, this thorn has sparked so many different interpretations over the centuries. I mean, was it a physical ailment?
Yeah.
Chronic illness? Disability? Or was it something more internal?
Right.
A spiritual struggle? Some nagging temptation? I've even heard theories about it being like a speech impediment. Or even like some kind of social stigma. I mean, the possibilities are endless, right? Which is probably why it's so captivating.
Absolutely. But no matter what it was, it clearly caused him a lot of pain. He describes begging God 3 times to take it away. You can almost hear the desperation in his voice.
And I was struck by his language, too. He uses the phrase messenger of Satan to describe this torment.
Yeah.
It really emphasizes how much he was suffering. So, what did God say? How did God respond to his prayers?
Well, God's response wasn't what Paul was expecting. Instead of removing the thorn, God says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." What do you make of that? Especially considering all we've talked about so far.
Wow. It's almost like God saying, I'm not going to take away your struggles, but I'll give you the strength to go through them. It's a huge lesson in acceptance, isn't it? Sometimes our thorns aren't meant to be removed. Maybe they're meant to refine us.
Right.
To show us where our true strength lies.
And to make us rely on God's grace.
And this totally challenges how we think about strength, doesn't it?
It does.
True strength isn't about avoiding suffering.
Yeah.
It's about facing it with courage and allowing God's grace to carry us through.
And this brings us back to that treasure in clay jars thing.
Full circle.
Even in our brokenness, we can still carry something beautiful and precious.
It's like those Japanese kintsugi bowls.
Yes.
Where they repair cracks with gold.
Beautiful.
The brokenness becomes part of the beauty. A sign of the object's resilience.
I love that image.
So we've explored Paul's suffering and how he finds strength in weakness. I think it's time for a little change of pace.
Okay. I like where you're going with this.
What do you say we shift gears and talk about Paul's inspiring message of generosity.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Let's unpack that. All right, so we've gotten a glimpse of Paul's vulnerability, his struggles, his reliance on God's grace. But now we're going to see a whole different side of him. Paul, the fundraiser, the motivator, the champion of generosity.
What I find so remarkable is how he rallies the Corinthians to support the Christians in Jerusalem who are really struggling. And he's not just like demanding money.
Right.
He's appealing to their compassion, their understanding of what the gospel really means when it talks about love and generosity.
Yeah. And he uses this amazing example, the Macedonian churches.
Oh, yes.
These were churches that were super poor themselves, but they gave way more than they could afford.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is.
Paul even says that their generosity exceeded his expectations.
Wow.
They were so eager to give, they practically begged him to take their money.
It's like they understood that giving isn't about how much you have, but about the attitude of your heart.
That's it, exactly.
And Paul makes that point really clear, doesn't he? God loves a cheerful giver.
He does.
What do you think he means by that? Is it just about, smiling when you write a check?
I think it goes much deeper than that. I think it's about having this inner disposition, this genuine desire to share what we have.
Right.
No matter how big or small.
And Paul even uses that image of sowing and reaping, right?
Yeah.
To illustrate this principle of abundance. So those who give generously are going to receive generously. Oh, hold on. Are we talking about like prosperity gospel here? Give might get rich quick? That doesn't sound like Paul.
No, not at all. While some people have definitely twisted his words to mean that kind of thing, I think he's getting at something much, much deeper. He's talking about a spiritual principle that goes way beyond just material wealth.
Okay.
When we give freely of ourselves, our time, our resources, our compassion, we actually open ourselves up to receiving abundance in return.
Okay, so not necessarily like material wealth, but abundance in like a spiritual and emotional sense.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, the more you give, the more you get. But it's not about some kind of transactional exchange with the universe or anything like that. It's about cultivating an attitude of generosity that ultimately blesses everyone involved.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does this tie back into that idea of living letters that we were talking about earlier? How does generosity or the lack of it play into that?
Well, think about it this way. Our willingness to give, whether it's our time, our money, or our compassion, it speaks volumes about our character, right? It's like this tangible expression of what we truly value.
So are we hoarding what we have? Or are we willing to share it freely with others?
Exactly. What kind of message is our society sending with its attitude towards those who are struggling? Are we embodying that radical generosity that Paul's talking about?
Or are we sending a different message?
That's a big question for all of us to consider, but let's not get too sidetracked. We've still got a lot to uncover in 2 Corinthians.
True. All right, let's get back to Paul. And I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, that passage where Paul warns against partnering with unbelievers. I know this one has been used to justify some pretty harmful things throughout history, so let's handle it with care.
Absolutely. Context is key here. Remember, Paul is writing to a church in Corinth, a city that was known for its,
let's just say, morally flexible reputation.
Yes, exactly. And these believers in Corinth, they were constantly being bombarded with influences and practices that directly contradicted their faith.
So this isn't about building walls and isolating ourselves from anyone who doesn't believe exactly what we believe.
Not at all. Paul's not advocating for some kind of spiritual isolationism here. He's more concerned about compromise, about the believers watering down their faith or getting sucked into practices that could lead them away from Christ.
Okay, that makes sense. But he still uses some pretty strong language, doesn't he? He even compares believers to the temple of the living God, this sacred space set apart for a specific purpose.
Right, and that's a powerful image. He's drawing this sharp distinction between what it means to follow Christ and what it means to embrace the values and practices of the culture around you.
So how do we apply this to our lives today? We're not living in ancient Corinth, surrounded by temples to Zeus and Aphrodite. How do we navigate that tension between engaging with the world and holding on to our spiritual integrity?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It takes a lot of discernment, wisdom, and self-awareness. We have to constantly ask ourselves, who am I spending time with? What am I letting into my life? What influences are shaping my thoughts and actions?
It's about drawing boundaries, not building walls.
That's it, exactly. And it's a constant process. We're all learning and growing, figuring out how to live out our faith in this complex and ever-changing world.
And remember, we're not meant to do it alone. We're part of a community, a body of believers who can support and encourage each other along the way.
That's so important.
You know, one thing that really strikes me about Paul is how he manages to be both uncompromising in his message and deeply compassionate towards people.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from speaking the truth, but he always does it with a heart full of love.
He's a master of tough love, that's for sure.
And speaking of tough love, let's not forget that thorn in the flesh we were talking about earlier. Paul went through some really intense hardship and suffering, but he also had this incredible vision of paradise, of the third heaven, where he heard things he couldn't even describe. That's quite a contrast.
It really is. And I think it speaks to the full range of human experience. The ups and downs, the joys and sorrows, the moments when we feel like we've got it all figured out, and the times when we're just wrestling with mystery.
And Paul doesn't try to hide any of it. He puts it all out there, the good, the bad, and the totally perplexing. And somehow it all comes together into this beautiful tapestry of faith that's both inspiring and incredibly relatable.
It's what makes 2 Corinthians such a powerful and enduring letter. It's a raw, honest, and ultimately hopeful look at what it means to live out one's faith in a messy and unpredictable world.
Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter in our deep dive. What other gems are we going to uncover in the second half of 2 Corinthians?
Well, let's dig into Paul's passionate defense of his ministry and see how he addresses all the accusations and doubts that were swirling around him in Corinth. This is where we really see his leadership skills and his rhetorical genius on full display.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it. Okay, so we've been through a lot with Paul. We've seen his vulnerable side, his strength, his passion, his struggles. It really feels like we're getting to know him as a person, doesn't it?
It does. And even though this letter was written like centuries ago, his words still feel so relevant today.
Right. It's like he's tapped into something fundamental about what it means to be human.
Totally. And speaking of tapping into something fundamental, we got to talk about his argument for the ministry of the Spirit over the ministry of the law. It's one of the most important themes in 2 Corinthians, I think.
It is. And it's kind of a radical idea for its time, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's basically challenging the whole system that had been in place for centuries.
Yeah. So remind us, what's the difference between these two ministries?
Well, he makes this brilliant comparison between Moses, who had to veil his face, right, to protect the Israelites from the fading glory of God's presence.
Right. After that whole Mount Sinai encounter.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that with the ministry of the Spirit, which operates through an unveiled glory and brings life and freedom through an internal change of heart, not through external rules and regulations.
So it's not about following a bunch of laws and rituals. It's about this inner transformation, this alignment of our hearts with God's will.
That's it. And that shift is reflected in how Paul talks about the Corinthians themselves. Remember that living letter metaphor?
Oh, yeah, I love that part.
He says they're a letter of recommendation for him, but written not with ink, but with the Spirit of God. It's such a beautiful image.
It is. He's basically saying their transformed lives, their actions, their love for each other are the most compelling evidence of his ministry.
Exactly. It's like their very existence is a testament to the power of the gospel. And that brings us back to that question we posed earlier. What kind of living letters are we writing with our own lives?
Oh, that's a good one.
Are we embodying the values we claim to hold? Are we reflecting the love and the grace and the compassion that we've received?
Yeah. It really makes you think about the impact we have on others. Whether we realize it or not, our actions, our words, even just our attitude, it all sends a message.
It does. Are we inspiring people or are we bringing them down?
Paul's letter really encourages us to step back and evaluate how we're living. Are we aligned with our deepest beliefs?
It's a powerful call to authenticity and a reminder that faith shouldn't just be a set of ideas. It should be a way of life, something that shapes everything we do.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 2 Corinthians, what's your final thought for our listeners? What's the one thing you really want them to take away from all this?
If I had to pick just one thing, it would be this. Embrace the paradox.
Oh, I like that.
Embrace the idea that strength can be found in weakness, that generosity can lead to abundance, and that true freedom comes from surrendering to something bigger than ourselves.
That's beautiful. And for everyone listening, I hope this deep dive has given you a little taste of the richness and depth of 2 Corinthians. But don't stop here. Go pick up a copy of the letter, read it slowly, and let Paul's words speak to your heart. You might be surprised by what you discover.
There's always more to explore, more to learn, more to uncover.
Until next time, keep diving deep.